The first time anyone saw him, the air felt wrong, not colder, not heavier, just wrong, as if the wind had paused to watch. He stood at the edge of the cornfield beside the old Miller property, a figure cut from silence, his hands folded neatly behind his back. The sheriff later said he looked like a preacher who'd forgotten his sermon, but the Millers knew better. Because the moment the stranger stepped forward, their oldest boy whispered that he'd seen the man before in a photograph taken 83 years earlier, a photograph no one alive should have remembered, let alone recognized. The boy pointed at the stranger's face and said, with a voice shaking like loose siding, "He hasn't aged." That statement didn't pass through the family like a rumor, it moved like a toxin. Suddenly, the elders stopped rocking in their chairs. They sat upright, rigid, almost reverent, and when the stranger asked for water, nobody answered, nobody moved, nobody even breathed right, because they'd all grown up on the same whispered bedtime warning: if he returns, don't speak to him. Don't look him in the eye. Don't let him know you remember. But here he was, the stranger from the old stories, the man who arrived once, nearly a century ago, and promised he'd come back when the soil needed him. No one knew exactly what that meant, but the ground on that property had absorbed more than storms, more than seeds, more than bones. When the Miller boy ran inside to show his father the photograph, a yellowed portrait of a harvest celebration from 1942, the panic seeped into the floorboards. Because the man in the old picture was identical in every way, same hair, same posture, same expression that wasn't quite a smile, but not quite a frown, a face frozen mid-thought, a face that should have changed with decades, sunlight, laughter, loss. Yet here it was, unchanged, untouched, and the worst part wasn't that he'd returned, it was that he returned exactly on time. Because according to an entry buried deep in the Miller family's private ledger, a ledger they never allowed outsiders to see, he always came back on the same day, during the same hour, wearing the same clothes, asking the same question. Is the bargain still honored? Tonight, for the first time since the war, someone would have to answer him. The Miller patriarch tried to steady his breath, but the air inside the farmhouse had already thickened into something that felt like old guilt. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, knuckles whitening as his son laid the photograph down. The stranger's unchanged face, staring upward like an accusation preserved in paper. The boy kept asking if it was some kind of trick, if maybe the man out there was a relative, a reenactor, anyone with a logical explanation. But the father knew better. He knew the truth didn't want to be logical. It wanted to be remembered. He told his son to stay inside, lock the door, pull the curtains, but the moment he stepped back outside, he realized the stranger hadn't moved an inch, not a shift of weight. Not a blink, as if time had wrapped itself around him and refused to pass. The only sign he was real was the faint impression his boots left in the soft dirt, prints that seemed too deep for a man of his size. As though something heavier stood inside his shape, the father asked what he wanted. The stranger tilted his head, polite, almost gentle. He repeated the question he'd asked in 1942, the same 8 words that had condemned the Miller line to decades of secrecy. Is the bargain still honored, as agreed? Even hearing them made the father's stomach tighten, because the bargain wasn't spoken about, not even at funerals. It lived between generations like a parasite, feeding on fear, surviving on silence. He told the stranger that times had changed, that the family knew nothing about old agreements, that whatever deal was struck back then had died with the ancestors who made it. But the stranger didn't argue. He never did. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small tin box, same shape, same rust pattern, same box seen in that 1942 photograph, held casually at his side like it contained something fragile or dangerous or both. He opened it without ceremony. Inside was a single brass token, engraved with a symbol the father recognized instantly, a symbol carved into the foundation stones of the Miller barn. A symbol the eldest always repainted whenever it began to fade. The stranger said the same words he had spoken 83 years before. The land remembers, even if you pretend you don't. And then he stepped closer, leaving footprints that seemed to sink too eagerly into the earth. The father wanted to run, but something about the stranger's presence made movement feel forbidden, as if any sudden gesture might invite consequences older than the farmhouse itself. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind hung back, waiting, listening, and the father realized in a way that felt instinctive, primal, that this interaction wasn't happening to him. It was happening through him, the latest vessel in a line destined to face whatever bargain his ancestors had bound themselves to. The stranger held out the brass token, palm up. The father refused to take it. He said the family wouldn't participate in anything they didn't understand, but the stranger didn't retreat. Instead, he asked a new question, one never recorded in the ledger, one the father had prayed would never be spoken. "Do you know what they traded me for?" The words slipped into the yard like a chill that belonged to winter, not late summer. The father tried to answer, but the truth was he had no idea. The oldest generation had been too terrified to explain the origins of the bargain, only its maintenance. Like caretakers tending a grave they were forbidden to open. But the stranger finally offered the answer himself. "They gave me a piece of their future," he said, "a thread from their line, a promise that one child in every generation belongs to me, whether they live long enough to understand it or not." The father felt his knees weaken. He demanded to know which child. He demanded names, details, anything to break the vagueness that had haunted the family for decades. But the stranger simply closed the tin box, as though the answer itself was irrelevant. As though the process had already begun. "You've noticed it," the stranger continued. "The way misfortune circles your bloodline, the way certain children are born different, quiet, marked, drawn to places you tell them not to go. Haven't you ever wondered why some of them never quite fit in your world?" The father's mind raced through memories he'd tried to bury: infants who never cried, toddlers who stared at corners of rooms with uncanny focus, adolescents who woke with mud under their nails after sleepwalking into fields they shouldn't have known existed. Then the stranger said something that froze the father's heart entirely. "One of your children has already been chosen. The selection happened long before you realized anything was wrong." The father asked who, begged for clarity. But the stranger didn't answer with words. He answered by turning his gaze toward the farmhouse window, toward the silhouette of a child watching from the shadows inside. The figure in the window vanished the instant the father turned, slipping back behind the curtain as though the house itself had swallowed them. A fresh surge of panic flushed through him, not just fear for the child, but fear of what the stranger saw when he looked into that window. The stranger's gaze wasn't curious, it wasn't predatory. It was claiming, as if he were simply checking inventory, as if the child inside belonged to him in a way no human bond could undo. The father shouted for his son, voice cracking. He sprinted to the porch, boots thudding against old boards. The screen door screeched open, and he stumbled into the hallway, calling names, calling desperately. No answer, just silence, a silence that felt wrong in a house that had always carried the restless noise of a growing family. He ran room to room, hands trembling, but the beds were empty, the closets were empty, the pantry, the mudroom, empty. All except for the smallest upstairs bedroom, a room the family kept shut, a room no one liked to enter, not since the day they noticed the walls sometimes echoed with faint scratching at night. He hesitated before turning the knob. That door had always felt colder than the others, as if it remembered a winter the rest of the house had forgotten. When it finally creaked open, he saw the child sitting cross-legged in the center of the floor, staring at something on the wood planks. Not crying, not afraid, just fixed, focused, as though listening to a voice vibrating beneath the boards. The father rushed in, kneeling beside them, grabbing their shoulders with shaking hands. But the child didn't react. Their eyes were glassy, pupils blown wide, reflecting something that wasn't the room they sat in. Then the father noticed the symbols carved into the floor, shallow markings, old, thin as paper cuts. They formed the same shape engraved on the brass token, the same shape repainted every year in the Miller barn, except now they were glowing faintly with the last rays of dusk, bleeding through the window, as if the dying light recognized the markings and wanted no part of them. Before he could speak, before he could shake the child back into the present, footsteps echoed behind him, slow, measured, inevitable. The stranger stood in the doorway, his silhouette blotting out what little safety the hall offered. "You've kept the room well," he murmured. "They always prepare it, even when they claim they've forgotten why." The father shielded the child with his body. He told the stranger he'd never allow this, never allow any claim on his blood. But the stranger only sighed, as though tired of repeating a lesson older than the house, older than the family, older than the land itself. "You don't have to allow it," he said softly. "The soil already has." The father felt something shift beneath the floorboards, not movement, not vibration, but a kind of awareness rising from the timber, as if the house itself were waking up. The stranger stepped inside the room, and the temperature dipped. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but subtly, the way a graveyard cools at dusk. The child still hadn't blinked. Their small hands rested on the carved symbol, fingers tracing its lines with an eerie, instinctive precision. Like they'd done it before, like they'd been doing it in their sleep. The father whispered their name, trying to reach them through whatever veil had settled over their mind. But the stranger answered instead, his voice soft enough to be mistaken for a thought. "They hear me, even when they don't understand the words yet, even when you try to keep them away from the fields." He crouched, not touching the child, only observing, his expression unreadable, not cruel, not kind, simply inevitable. The father demanded to know what the bargain actually required, what his ancestors had promised. The stranger tilted his head, studying the carved symbol as though it were a relic from a world that never fully touched this one. "A harvest," he said, "a harvest of potential, one soul's path diverted, not taken, not destroyed, redirected. Your line offered me a child of each generation in exchange for protection from a calamity that would have swallowed your ancestors whole." He paused. "A calamity they never told you about because surviving it cost them more shame than pride." The father tried to argue that no one had the right to make such a choice for future generations. The stranger simply replied, "That's what every generation says, right before they repeat the ritual anyway." The child blinked for the first time, slowly. Their pupils shrank back to normal size. They looked up at their father with confusion, as if waking from a dream too deep to remember. "Why am I on the floor?" they asked. The father lifted them into his arms, holding them so tight their breath hitched. But he could feel it an echo beneath their skin, faint but undeniable, like something had brushed against their soul and left a fingerprint. The stranger stood, brushing dust from his coat. "The selection is not a punishment," he said. "It is a debt being paid, one your ancestors accepted to keep this land alive." The father wanted to scream that the land wasn't worth his child, that nothing was. But the stranger only looked at him with quiet, weary certainty. "You think you're the first to say that. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The father carried the child downstairs, steps unsteady, breath thin and ragged. Every creak of the staircase felt like the house whispering a reminder he didn't want to hear, that this had all happened before. Generations ago, in this same place, under this same roof, with different fathers pleading for the same impossible mercy. The stranger followed at a respectful distance, but there was nothing respectful about his presence. He felt like a shadow stretching across years, not floors. When they reached the kitchen, the child clung to the father's shirt, still disoriented. The father set them on a chair, crouching to meet their eyes, searching for any sign, any trace that whatever influence had touched them upstairs was gone. But their gaze wandered to the window overlooking the fields. They stared too long, too still, as if the wind moving the crops were trying to speak their name. The father shut the curtains. Behind him, the stranger leaned against the doorframe. "It doesn't help," he said quietly. "Closing the windows, locking the doors, you're trying to protect them from something that's already inside." The father snapped, demanding to know what the stranger wanted now, tonight. Why he had returned on this exact year, this exact day, this exact hour. The stranger's reply was almost sorrowful. "This is the year the debt matures. Every bargain has a cycle. Every cycle has a culmination. Tonight is simply the night your line must answer." The father's voice broke as he said he would not give up his child. "Could not, would not." The stranger nodded as though he expected nothing less. "They all say that," he murmured, "but the choice was never about surrender. It was about acknowledgement. Your child was marked at birth, destined long before they took their first breath." The father grabbed a kitchen knife. It trembled in his hand, but his eyes were steady. He told the stranger he'd die before letting anyone claim his child. The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He only stepped forward, letting the dim kitchen light draw sharp angles across his ageless face. "You misunderstand what I am," he said. "I don't come to take them. I come to guide them. Your ancestors didn't give me children to consume. They offered me the ones who didn't belong here in the first place." The father froze. "What are you saying?" The stranger lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Some children are born with a foot in two worlds. They don't fit yours because they were never meant to. Your line has carried that fragment for centuries, and every few generations, one child awakens to it." The father turned slowly toward his child, who was still staring at the curtains, as though trying to see through the fabric. "They're not being taken," the stranger said. "They're being called home." The father's grip on the knife loosened, not from acceptance, but from the terrible weight of those words, called home. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. His child was born in the upstairs bedroom of this farmhouse, crying under the same rattling ceiling fan that had hung there since his own childhood. They'd taken their first steps on these floors, skinned their knees on this porch, learned their first words at this very kitchen table. How could any part of them belong anywhere else? But the stranger watched him with a patience that felt older than language. "You've seen the signs," he said. "The way they wander the fields without knowing why, the way they stop and listen to empty air, the way the soil accepts their footprints more deeply than anyone else's." He paused, letting the father's memories fill in the rest. "Your line carries a spark of something that isn't entirely human, and every cycle, one child's spark catches flame." The father felt sick, because he had noticed things, strange, quiet moments he'd dismissed as quirks. He'd seen the child stand barefoot in the yard at dawn, eyes closed, as though greeting something he couldn't see. He'd found drawings in their room, spirals, patterns, shapes he didn't recognize, but that now reminded him of the carved symbol upstairs. The child wasn't troubled. They weren't haunted. They were waiting. The stranger stepped closer, lowering his voice so only the father could hear. The land chose your bloodline because your ancestors survived something unspeakable, something that scarred them in ways they couldn't erase. They sought protection from forces older than this country, and in doing so, they mingled their legacy with mine. He gestured gently toward the child. They feel that pull, it frightens you, but to them it has always been familiar. The father shook his head, trembling. They're my child. The stranger didn't argue. And they always will be. Nothing I do changes that. Their body stays, their life continues, but their path shifts away from the ruin your ancestors feared. The father stepped back, confusion twisting into anger. You said you take a child every generation. No, the stranger said softly. I said your ancestors offered one, but I've never taken anything. I guide what already belongs to my world. I ensure they survive the awakening. The father swallowed hard. And if I refuse, if I fight this, the stranger finally looked at him, truly looked with an expression that held no malice, only an ancient, weary truth. Then your child will awaken alone, without guidance, without understanding, and what calls to them will not wait kindly. The father turned toward the child, who now stood quietly beside the curtained window, small hand pressed against the fabric, as though feeling for something just beyond it. Their voice broke the silence. Dad, it's calling again, and the father realized the final horror. The choice was never his to make, and it never had been.